Hey, deadly listeners, welcome to the Indigipreneur Podcast, a show that helps you gain a better understanding of Indigenous entrepreneurship and answer all your related questions. I'm your host, Dean Foley, an Indigenous entrepreneur with over 5 years' experience in the field. In today's episode, we hear from Brendan about Aboriginal economic participation and the rise of self-identification, which he spoke about at the First Nations Economic Forum.
How you going there, Michael? Can you hear me?
Right. So it's a webinar style, not like a Zoom chat. But I think we can I think we can let them talk.
Okay. That's all good. That's all good. It's 5 past. I might kick off and then people can join as they actually need to, if that's all right. Look, firstly, I'd like to say Yamabawa, Yamadagan, it's Yama Milie, it's Yamagera Ningada. It's in my language group, which is the Gomeroi Kamilario people, Gomeroi language group from Northern Plains. Hello, brothers, hello, sisters, hello, friends, welcome everybody. Look, I want to firstly pay my respects and acknowledge country. I'm sitting here on the land of the Darkinjung people. I want to pay my respects to the ancestral connections here that go back over 60,000 years. Here in Darkinjung country, we live in an area that's part of the central piece of our creation story for New South Wales. And I want to make sure that I acknowledge that and pay respects to that, because the Central Coast is important, not just for the Darkinjung people, but for the Warramai, for the Wiradjuri, for the Gomeroi, for the Ngarigo, for so many different nations across New South Wales. I'd also like to pay my respects to the ancestors, the elders, and the emerging leaders that wherever participants to this session are actually sitting in today. It always was, always will be Aboriginal land, and we need to make sure that we actually honour and recognise those ancient ancestral connections. So, as per my bio, my name's Brendan Moyle. Look, I'm a Gomeroi Kamilario man. It's connections through Moyle and throughout northwestern New South Wales. I'm currently the CEO of Darkinjung Local Aboriginal Land Council. So we are the largest local Aboriginal Land Council in New South Wales. I might start in terms of paying my respects as well to Dean for coordinating this. Thanks, brother. This is an important conversation. It's something we need to actually continue to have. I guess the first slide that I wanted to actually go through was really start to unpack what the overarching narrative actually is that you've created, which is decolonise the economy. For me, to decolonise is to withdraw from a colony, leaving it independent. But in this context, decolonise refers to moving away from a colonial approach to the economy to enable Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to activate all their interests within the economy. The economy itself is a structure of conditions of economic life in a country area or economic system. It includes fiscal policy. It includes the way that markets actually work. It includes the environment and the way that things are commodified, and that money itself fundamentally changes hands within that economy, and how that actually supports the growth of that economy. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander economy refers to our economies. We have ancient economies. We were the first traders. We were the first miners. We were the first farmers. We have an ancestral connection that goes back over 60,000 years across Australia and the Torres Strait. But part of the challenge for us is how do we actually start to apply and adapt some of those ancient economic approaches into the modern economy, which unfortunately is one that we don't necessarily control and that we aren't necessarily a major player in. And lastly, in terms of defining it, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I'll go into some of the challenges that we face in terms of understanding the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander economy, which is linked to this. But Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of Australia, some people that are certified within the legal definition. This requires that people are of Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander descent, so that's heritage. They identify as an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person to the community that they're choosing to be part of and choosing to identify within, and that they are accepted as an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person by that community. The reason I raise that is because when we talk about decolonising the economy, we've got a number of opportunities that happen at local, state and national levels. But quite often those opportunities aren't necessarily delivering the intended social policy outcomes and socio-economic outcomes. For me, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander economic development is true self-determination. Many years ago, I was lucky enough within our land rights movement to work alongside some of my elders that sat on the then New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council. We realised that economic empowerment, having our own money, or what we call wallang here in New South Wales, our communities having their own wallang, being able to make their own decisions, being able to actually be accountable to their communities, to invest the money that they actually have where it's needed. That is true self-determination. Through economic development, we can embed our cultural law, as in LORE, and our practices for the benefit of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities. We have our own funds to do with as we choose. As I said, we can choose to serve our elders in the way that we need. We can choose to support the current generation in the workforce, and we can choose to build our future generations, not reliant on the policies or the funding of external parties, but we as Aboriginal people can actually choose to do that. For me, as the CEO of Darkinjung Local Aboriginal Land Council, I see my place is to serve our people, to serve our communities, to serve our land rights movement by serving our membership and by serving our board. They are the ones that make the decisions in terms of what our strategic goals are, how we start to realise our intersections with the economy, but also what we do with the proceeds that we actually generate through that. Having economic independence gives us true independence, as we are no longer bound to governments or charities for our own needs. We can choose to work with them, we can choose to engage with them, we can choose to make use of their funding, of their opportunities, of their services. But again, it's we choose. It's not that we need. So as I said, Darkinjung Local Aboriginal Land Council, we're located here on the central coast of New South Wales. We're incorporated under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act 1983. The Aboriginal Land Rights Act in New South Wales is very different to other land rights processes across Australia, which have been formally based on the form of trusts, Aboriginal land trusts, or around native title. When we actually secure our land, we secure our land freehold. You don't have to be a traditional owner to be a member of a local Aboriginal Land Council. Now, in saying that, we operate and we recognise traditional and cultural authority where there are traditional owners. The reason why in New South Wales it was set up in that way is because we were the ones that bore the brunt of colonial impact, of settlement. We were the ones that had the first policies of dispossession, assimilation, assassination, massacres. We were the first ones that started to actually encounter those policies, that broke our ancestral connections with many of our lands. We were the first ones to be forcibly relocated and placed elsewhere. So in recognition of that, the Aboriginal Land Rights Act actually allows a mechanism for Aboriginal people to become members of our local Aboriginal Land Councils, as defined by the membership of our land councils and the Aboriginal Land Rights Act. And it's not exclusively based on native title or the need to prove native title. So Darkinjung land, we're located on the central coast of New South Wales. As I said, it is like when I first moved up here, many of my elders and many of the mob said, you know, this is God's country. And it is. It's truly beautiful. We're quite unique in some of the opportunities that we have, which I'll go into. Our boundaries stretch from Catherine Hill Bay to the north, near Awaba, which is the traditional name for Lake Macquarie, to the Hawkesbury River in the south, or Dirrabin, as it was traditionally known by many of our Aboriginal people across New South Wales, the Pacific Ocean in the east and the Waddigan Mountains to the west. The Waddigan Mountains themselves are actually truly spectacular because within that, there's a mountain called Mount Yengo. And that's the birthplace of our creation story here in New South Wales, for much of New South Wales, not all of New South Wales, but for much of New South Wales. We're looking at how we actually celebrate, how we preserve and protect that as Aboriginal people, recognising that it gives economic outcomes and economic opportunities. Our creation story recognises that the army came down from the Mirrabooka, came down from the stars. The Mirrabooka is the Milky Way, it is the galaxy, it is the Southern Cross. He came down, he landed at Mount Yengo, he created life, he lived amongst the people. He gave us kinship, he gave us language, he gave us knowledge, he gave us law. When he left to go back to the sky, back to the Mirrabooka, he left many of his sky spirits here that became our totems. Now that's a common story for much of New South Wales, not all, but much of New South Wales. Each of us have slight variations within it. For us, what I was always taught for our people was that the army was also the life giver, because when you're sitting out on the northwest tablelands where we come from, the sun rises in the east where the army came down. You look to the east, look to Mount Yengo. That's important for us because it also recognises that the Central Coast was always a historic meeting place for many of our people. Some of the early colonists actually wrote down records. They thought there was going to be a full-scale invasion. Because thousands and thousands of Aboriginal men had come, young men, old men, warriors, had all come at the back of the Central Coast. What they didn't realise initially, but they did soon realise, was that those men came from nations, from Aboriginal nations, Aboriginal tribal groups, from across New South Wales to practice ceremony at the birthplace of our creation story. I live and we operate in the traditional lands of Darkinjung people and the Darkinjung language. We also have one of the fastest growing Aboriginal populations in Australia, with over 17,000 people now identified as living in the Central Coast, according to the 2021 ABS census. Between 2011 and 2016, the census data showed that our population here grew by 38%. And then between the 2016 and 2021 census by 36%. That's compared with the national increase of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population of 25%. That poses interesting challenges and opportunities for us as people, which I'll get into. Our core functions are community participation and wellbeing. We run programs through economic development, through supporting economic development. We promote community. We bring community in and we look at providing services that help our community. That includes scholarships and sponsorships for education for elders, community events and activities that try to unite and bring our people together so they can actually celebrate as Aboriginal people and they can celebrate culture and we can preserve and promote Aboriginal cultural heritage. We provide culture, heritage and environmental support as well, which is an area of growth for us in terms of how we look at the economy. We run our governance and operations, which includes all our compliance under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act and all other relevant legislation. And we're also trying to grow businesses and economic development opportunities, which I'll talk about more in a second. So what are Darkinjung's business opportunities? We're progressing a number of enterprise opportunities, including land management services, cultural heritage management services, and cultural education and tourism. Those are growth areas for us, not just as an Aboriginal Land Council, but for us as an Aboriginal community. We currently own over 3,700 hectares of land here on the Central Coast. And so what we're looking to do is to grow our enterprise opportunities and extend what we're already doing, what we're already required to do for our people and our communities and our land, and start to commoditise that and commercialise that so we can generate a revenue. Those enterprise opportunities as they grow will allow us to train and employ more local Aboriginal people, creating wealth and prosperity at a local level. The land management and cultural heritage management service faces a number of obstacles though, including lack of government commitment to apply the Indigenous procurement policy and the Aboriginal procurement policy. While there is overarching support at senior levels, operational staff are often obstacles to these opportunities. People claiming to be Aboriginal but not meeting the legal definition of Aboriginal people, establishing their own enterprises and providing cultural heritage management services themselves, using our cultural identity and our heritage to compete against legitimate Aboriginal enterprises to be able to actually provide fee for service. And Aboriginal people with no connection or authority on the Central Coast establishing their own entities to provide cultural heritage management services here. In New South Wales, there is a requirement with developments and land developments that entities need to, as part of the planning process, go through what they call registered Aboriginal parties. Our list of registered Aboriginal parties includes people that have never proven their identity to us, and so we're unable to verify that they are actually Aboriginal people, but they've been put forward and generating significant revenue from it. We also have people who have no connection to Darkinjung country. Not saying that they need to be Darkinjung people, because we don't have many, if any, people with traditional connection left here on the Central Coast because of the impact of massacres, the impact of wars, the impact of disease. But people who don't actually live here, people who don't have connection here, want to come in and provide a fee for service on what is cultural heritage and cultural services here on the Central Coast, a place where they have no connection. I often liken it that if you look at Europe, it's like having French people turning up in Croatia to provide cultural services. They might be connected through base tenets and belief. They might all be European, but they're not the same. So what are Darkinjung's other economic development opportunities? Look, Darkinjung, it started in 2001 where Darkinjung secured a land claim over a disused and contaminated garbage tip. The former board of Darkinjung actually took Wyong Council to court and forced them to remediate it. They then sold the land, which gave them an economic base for the future. It allowed them to put a few $1 million aside to be able to provide funeral services, to be able to provide immediate services, but also start to build an economy of scale by which Darkinjung can continue to develop and grow. I'm lucky enough and fortunate enough to serve the current board and our current community who have grown from that, and we're continuing to progress other opportunities. We're just finalising now the public consultation and the zoning process for residential development at Lake Memora of between 450 and 600 properties. The Carry On residential development, which is 60 properties. Our Peat Island Cultural Tourism Precinct. And if you look to the slide deck, you'll see Peat Island. We're negotiating with the New South Wales Government to take possession of that. It's a disused asylum. And what we want to do is to identify and partner with strong accommodation service providers who can help us invest money into it, to lift it, to raise it, where we can provide a unique cultural tourism precinct with world-class accommodation, with restaurants, with cafes, but with Aboriginal culture and that creation story sitting at the heart of it, so that people realise they can come within an hour's drive of the Sydney CBD and have a unique cultural tourism experience that showcases, that preserves, that promotes and protects the traditional law, as in LORE, and our culture. People no longer feel like they need to travel to Cape York, to the Northern Territory, to other far remote locations to experience Aboriginal culture. They can experience our culture here, which is complementary to the cultural experiences they can have elsewhere. And we're also looking at developing our Wallara and Bushells Ridge industrial developments. And the focus on that is particularly leveraging the current Australian environment, where we have a huge conversation happening now about what I call industrial sovereignty. COVID and the Ukrainian war have caused inflation to rise, have caused disruptions to supply chains. We've become so reliant on globalisation that we're importing so much of our products, so much of what we actually need, and we're not producing as much here in Australia. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be part of globalisation, because we should. That's the way of the future. But we need to maintain our own industrial sovereignty. But to maintain industrial sovereignty, you need a couple of key things. You need land, and it needs to be activated. You need accessibility of that land in terms of transport systems. You need power and energy, and you need people as resources. Darkinjung's proud, and where we're taking Darkinjung even further within industrial developments, is to look particularly at where we have land, we have access to infrastructure, transport infrastructure, and we have people as Aboriginal people, as a growing population. The biggest asset we have within that, though, is what we call the Aboriginal SEP. It's a planning document that allows the New South Wales government to bypass many of the actual protracted planning processes. It allows us to be able to bypass some of the challenges we face with local governments, to be able to negotiate directly with the state government, to be able to develop some of our land, not all of our land, but some of our land. The challenge with that, though, is that it's not actually a requirement of government. Ministers and bureaucrats can choose whether or not they apply it or not. And it's quite often reliant on other government processes like biodiversity and biocertification. Now, the challenge for us as developers is that we're unlike any other developer. Any other developers, if they've got a 200 hectare parcel of land, they want to develop as much as they possibly can with that. As I said earlier, we have 3,700 hectares of land. We have another 13,000 under claim, and we're currently negotiating. We've started the negotiations for 4,200 hectares to come across. Out of all of that land, we only want to develop about 10%, because that 10% will allow us to build an economic future, that true self-determination for our people. It will allow us to build that and to take that forward for our people and for our communities, and where we can actually look after the rest of the land. So the biggest barriers are institutionalised discrimination in government systems and community expectations. We're also exploring other opportunities around economic development, around cultural burning, and particularly environmental management. The Central Coast is home to approximately 367,000 people, and shaped through original towns that are spread across the coast, but are now forming a larger region, urban-based region, but it's still regional. This creates significant green corridors, which is fantastic for environmental and biodiversity outcomes, but poses significant risks. Because if bushfires actually get in there, it means that you've got thousands and thousands of homes and businesses that are at risk. We're currently building our opportunities through enterprises to be able to look at how do we actually start having conversations with government, with private entities, and with insurance companies. Because for us, cultural burning isn't just about actually practicing our culture, but it's bringing a contemporary interpretation of ancient cultural practices that will actually help to address risk to the broader society. Some of the clippings I've actually put up there was that particularly the Indigenous, the Bega Local Aboriginal Land Council many years ago actually did a cultural burn on some of their land. Tarthara, a little township just outside of Bega, was almost wiped out. Half of Tarthara was almost completely destroyed. The other half was saved. The half that was saved was because of Aboriginal cultural fire practices, cultural burns, that meant that the fire itself swept through and then stopped. One of the big challenges that we actually face, though, is the growth of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population, and particularly the impact that has in terms of our ability to really understand, firstly, what is the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander economy, and what has been the impact of it. So under the 2021 census, 812,000 people identified as being Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. You can self-identify. This is the challenge. It equates to 3.2% of the total population, which is an increase of 2.8% from 2016, and 2.5% from 2011. That includes a 25% total population increase since the 2016 census. But that exceeds our birth rates in our populations. So what we've got is people who are identifying as Aboriginal people who don't necessarily meet the legal and legislative definition of people. They may have some long lost ancestry, but that in itself is insufficient to be an Aboriginal person. And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. One thing I often say though is that for many people, they find with a level of pride over the last couple of decades that they've got an English ancestor that came over on the first fleet. And there's a lot of Australians who are really proud of that. And that's a fine thing. But just because you've got an English ancestor that came out on the first fleet doesn't make you an English citizen. It doesn't make you an English expert in an expert in English law as in LORE, law as in LAW, or culture. So what we call for is that the same processes, the same expectations are applied to our people. The increase in identification, as said, is outstripping our birth rates. In 2021, 51.1% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are under the age of 25, compared with 55% in 2011. That shows that our population is getting older, but suddenly it's growing significantly. It's not birth rates, it's people that are self-identifying. Part of what we're going to talk about is that what is the proportion, trying to understand what is the proportion of that, but also what the impact is on outcomes for legitimate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people because of that, particularly from an economic perspective. I've put up, and with the slideshow, all participants can access that, but I've actually put up a recent article from Susie Ingram, who raises serious concerns about this in terms of box ticking. So understanding Aboriginal identity. The Australian Law Commission identifies that in the early 1980s, the Commonwealth Department of Aboriginal Affairs established a new three-part Aboriginality definition. It requires that an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person is a person who has Aboriginal heritage, so it's descent, being able to prove that descent, who identifies as an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person and is accepted as such by the community in which they live. This definition was then the basis for some other pieces of legislation like the Aboriginal Land Rights Act in 1983, which operates here in New South Wales, that we function under. But it was also defined in common law proceedings. Under the Mabo 2 case, which was the precursor for the Native Title Act, Justice Brennan determined that membership of the Indigenous people depends on biological descent from the Indigenous people. Mutual recognition of a person's particular person's membership by that person and the elders, and by elders or other persons enjoying traditional authority amongst those people. That means for me to identify as a Gomeroi man, I need to identify with the Gomeroi nation. And I need to have my elders, my Gomeroi, my Kamilario elders, accept me as a Gomeroi man. For me, as an Aboriginal person living here on the Central Coast, I have to identify as an Aboriginal person living here on the Central Coast. And it has to be accepted by the community because they are the ones that have traditional authority. Under Gibbs versus Capel in 1995 and then Shaw versus Wolf in 98, which were ATSIC cases, the legal definitions were further unpacked that said some degree of descent is necessary, but is not in itself sufficient condition of eligibility to be considered an Aboriginal person under relevant legislative instruments. And a small degree of Aboriginal descent coupled with genuine self-identification and or communal recognition may, in a given case, be sufficient to determine eligibility. The challenge is, though, it's us as Aboriginal people. It's us through legitimate Aboriginal entities that have cultural authority. It's us that choose who are Aboriginal people, not people who set up their own organisation or corporation to prove their Aboriginality. Where this becomes a real issue, and we're going to go into it, a real example, which I've put in the slide deck, is the mysterious case of the Ngarigo people of northern Sydney and the Central Coast. Part of what blocks many of our economic development opportunities is people who identify as being Ngarigo. Many of these people have never proven their Aboriginality in accordance with the three-part definition to us as an Aboriginal community, to us as a local Aboriginal Land Council, to the AMS or anyone else. They also haven't proven their native title. They've claimed that they're native title applicants, but their claim was withdrawn. They've claimed that they couldn't afford it. But we all know that the Australian government provides funding support for anyone that is a legitimate claimant for native title. Further to that, what they do is they create businesses, cultural tourism businesses, cultural heritage protection and management businesses, and they generate tens of thousands of dollars a month based on these claims of traditional ownership and claims of Aboriginality. That takes and influences and dilutes opportunities for legitimate Aboriginal people who meet the three-part definition, who meet the legal conditions of being an Aboriginal person. I often liken it to practice as a lawyer. You can't do as a solicitor. You can't just have a law degree. That's like having descent. You have to go out and prove yourself. You have to get your practicing certificate, which is like being identifying yourself, getting the qualifications. So you're proving your heritage. You're identifying yourself to the community. And then to be able to practice as a lawyer, you have to be accepted by the Bar Association. It's the same for us. Imagine the uproar if people were saying and claiming that they were lawyers, never proving that they were lawyers. But we're taking away some work from legitimate lawyers within the legal profession. But more than that, we're providing their own interpretation to the law, which was distorting the application of the law. It's the same for us, with many people coming out of the woodwork who recreate cultural law, as in LORE, or their interpretation of it to validate who they actually are. The example of this, and there's some documents there, that the Northern Beaches local government ceased recognising Guringai as traditional owners based on the advice of the New South Wales Heritage Office. I've provided some excerpts there. The Aboriginal Heritage Office identifies that the use of the term Guringai, referring to Aboriginal people of the region, was based on a 19th century fiction. However, it does not stop them from claiming identity and from trying to generate and intersect and take their part of what we call the Aboriginal economy. They set up businesses. They talk about cultural heritage protection, anthropology, education, and tourism. When we talk about decolonisation, I often say the first wave of colonisation was the invasion or the settlement of Australia. It included the stolen generation, assimilation, massacres, murders, dispossession. That was the first wave of colonisation. The second wave of colonisation that we now see is the colonisation of our identity and the taking away of our identity by watering it down. On the 20th of May, 2021, the Australian newspaper published a story titled Guringai Rejected Over Indigenous Link Doubts, which stated that Laurie Bimson, which I've provided a photo there, proclaims himself a Guringai man, a descendant of King Ngarigo. The article also noted that the claim connection was only identified in 2004 by Bob Waterer, and that Mr. Bolt, when he found, actually, and the articles are on the next page, when he found a birth certificate in an old wallet at the back of an old cupboard. Mr. Bimson himself, according to that article, acknowledged he only discovered his links to King Ngarigo, which have never been proven through native title, through Bob Waterer, but said, yeah, so what about it? So, the next day on the 21st of May, the Australian newspaper published a story titled Guringai Rejected Over Indigenous Link Doubts, which noted that National Parks and Wildlife Service had chosen to stop using the term for Guringai on all science, maps and interpretive material. It went on to state that in 2019, a senior National Parks and Wildlife Service officer officially stated that after meeting Mr. Bimson, that Laurie acknowledged the use of Guringai is not appropriate in the way it is being used in Sydney and has been moving away from using it. But if you look to the right side of the slide, he still promotes his Guringai Aboriginal tours. The article also noted the National Parks and Wildlife Service had requested more than a year earlier that he stop advertising on his Guringai Aboriginal Tours website that his people have been the custodians of Guringai country for more than 40,000 years. And again, the information taken from his own website shows that he's still claiming those things. Yet the evidence is there to show that it's not. There are serious concerns about that, because here we have people who have not proven their Aboriginality in accordance with the three-part definition, but who are entering the Aboriginal economy, the Indigenous, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander economy, to make their money out of it. And unfortunately, what we quite often see, and this isn't an individual case, but we have people taking away from legitimate businesses. We have people who, and a lot of non-Indigenous people are well-intentioned, and they listen to these things. They act on those things. It even got to the point where the local Aboriginal community was opposing a coal mine here on the Central Coast. One of the people who purports to be a traditional owner, and we've seen already what the Heritage Office said. I don't have a personal position on this, but the evidence is the evidence. That went out and actually signed a deal with a mining company to be able to mine the land for scholarships that their own sons, their own children managed to get, and were one of the primary beneficiaries of. We also have, though, the actual Guringai people who have been fighting to reclaim their sovereignty, to reclaim their identity, saying they don't recognise these people as being Guringai. These are people who are legitimate native title claimants and are being represented and supported by the New South Wales and state government in pursuing those rights. And they're sitting back saying, well, hang on 2 seconds, how come these people are actually commoditising their identity? They're commoditising their identity to build their own economic outcomes. So where it gets interesting, and moving beyond just individual cases like that, for me, as I said, I'll let people make their own minds up. The evidence is the evidence, so people can reach out. So in 2001, the ABS census showed that across socio-economic outcomes, there is still significant disparity with the non-Indigenous population. The gap is still there. The map on the right-hand side shows the average household income across Australian society for each of the jurisdictions. However, the median income for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander households was $830 per week, which is significantly lower than each of those. However, though, it also identifies that 1/3 of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander households now have an average household income of more than $1,000 a week. I take you back to the earlier point that was made that in various articles and substantiated that our population is growing faster than our birth rates. I've firsthand seen people who identify suddenly based on the claims of some long lost ancestor who come without the disadvantage that Aboriginal people quite often have come from. They've got multiple properties, investment properties, they've got higher education standards, and that's okay. But what that does is that artificially elevates the statistics, but our statistics are still there. Education. The proportion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people between 20 and 24 years that has completed Year 12 has now increased to 56% from 37.1% in 2011. Now, absolutely, there are some increases there. But how many of those are people that are now suddenly identifying for university to access those opportunities that are intended for people who don't have it? Education. Education, 10.2% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population aged 18 to 24 were attending university or higher education institutions, which was up from 6.6%. I encourage people to look out there and look at the media, look at the concerns that are happening out there. For Darkinjung, we ourselves actually took one of the major tertiary education institutions to the ICAC for corrupt conduct, because they've been allowing people to tick a box and self-identify to receive benefits. They don't meet the legal three-part definition. They don't meet the requirements that are there. But there's a lot of money tied up in it. And this is unfortunately now part of the Indigenous economy. The National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Survey identified that between 2007 and 8 and 28-19, the overall employment rate for Indigenous Australians dropped from 54 to 49%, while the rate for non-Indigenous Australians remained roughly stable at 76%. So what does this actually mean if it's between 25 and 30% of the Aboriginal population, potentially what is now being called box tickers, people who identify as being Aboriginal to access benefits, identify within the census, but don't meet the legal definition of an Aboriginal person, and who can't prove their Aboriginality with the relevant cultural authority in accordance with those three-part definitions. So the document that I've got there, I've shown, if you've got 25 to 30% of people who don't meet it, meet the definition, the population looks greater than it is, firstly, distorting the demographics. Aboriginal average household income increases because those people are artificially pulling the figures up. Average household income is high, but the statistics don't change for those that are in the lower income, and quite often they're worse off. The Closing the Gap reports quite often show that there aren't the level of traction and changes in terms of socioeconomic outcomes. Personal wealth indicators, home ownership, economic participation, all of those things are automatically pulled up. But if the statistics aren't changing, that means that they're being significantly distorted, because those people that are actually amongst the lowest and the poorest, life is actually getting harder and worse. The policies aren't meeting their needs. They're meeting the needs of the people who actually don't need the benefits. And educational outcomes are being misrepresented as illegitimate people identifying and being given benefits intended to address disadvantage, cutting out those who live with that disadvantage. Their lives continue to get worse while everyone else's gets better. And unfortunately, the statistics themselves change. The next slide I took straight from the Closing the Gap report here in 2022, and it shows some of the key indicators. Life expectancy is nowhere near what the non-Indigenous is. Children developmentally are not on track. Suicide rates are significantly higher. Preschool enrolment's actually higher, which is a positive thing. But when you look at the children that were in out-of-home care in 2021, it's still it's not meeting the targets. Children commencing school were developmentally on track. It's still only 34.3%. Adults in prison is still well behind the targets. And people who took their own lives. So the question for me that we all need to ask is, if people are self-identifying and they're skewing the statistics and they're making the statistics look better than they are, but some of those statistics are really not looking good, then what's happening to the people that we represent as a land rights movement? What's happening to the people that we represent at local levels? If I drive back to Moyle, if I drive through Dubbo, if I drive down here on the Central Coast to where the active community are, if I go back down to the South Coast, I see people living in the same levels of poverty, if not getting worse. It's not getting better. So the government's major intersections in terms of the Aboriginal economy were, particularly for the federal perspective, the Indigenous procurement policy. It was established by the Commonwealth Government in 2015 and designed to use the government's purchasing power to increase Indigenous enterprises to engage in the economy. I say Indigenous, not Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, because many of those organisations don't meet the community test for being Aboriginal organisations. There continues to be claims about fake Aboriginality around black cladding, where Aboriginal people are used to basically hide and provide opportunities to be able to generate profits for entities that aren't actually Aboriginal. This position was supported by Boyd Hunter's caper paper from the ANU in 2014, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander businesses are between 30 and 100 times more likely to employ Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people than non-Indigenous businesses. The policy itself and the investment with that was therefore based on the principle of trickle-down economics, that you spend that money in those Aboriginal organisations and suddenly it's going to actually trickle down. You're going to have high levels of wealth creation, employment, outcomes. That's going to flow into education for our kids. But as we've seen with the previous slides, that doesn't seem to be happening. There are certain provisions under the Indigenous procurement policy that enable government to target, particularly grants worth $80,000 to $200,000 they can direct select, but they also get a competitive advantage. This was designed to address a market failure. Government decided to actually give preferential treatment to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people because there was market failure in their ability to be able to tender for that work for government, but also how they used that to then create an economy of scale that would enable them to intersect with the broader marketplace. Since 2015, the Indigenous procurement policy has now generated over $5.3 billion in contracting opportunities for Indigenous business opportunities. It's involved over 35,763 contracts. That was taken from the National Indigenous Australians Agency site. But how much of that money has actually gone to the Indigenous economy? How much has created personal wealth or increased household income and the employment of Aboriginal people? How much of that money is actually translated through to supporting Aboriginal people actually buy their own homes? Legitimate people who meet the three-part definition. The statistics I showed you earlier, which was taken from various government reports, are showing things are quite often not getting better. Sometimes they're getting worse. And the distortion of the statistics, quite often by the people who are accessing these benefits, because they don't want to compete in a normal fair marketplace. They're trying to compete using the market benefits the government's actually providing. They're getting better. We're seeing people getting richer, but not our communities. So when we talk about the decolonising the economy, we need to actually look and go back to the original position of the Indigenous procurement policy, which was not to make individuals wealthy in isolation. We want people to be wealthy. We want people, legitimate Aboriginal people, to have pride, to be wealthy, to create their own wealth, intergenerational wealth. But we want that across our communities. The question I pose to everyone here today is, has that actually happened? In New South Wales, the New South Wales government has almost replicated, but has aligned an Aboriginal procurement policy, which commenced on the 1st of January 2021. Been going for about 18 months now. But our problem with that isn't just people who are claiming to be Indigenous, who are suddenly reaping the benefits of this, but our biggest problem is encouraging and convincing government employees at the local level to actually give us a chance. Every land management contract that we can get, and we haven't gotten one. We've been lobbying state forests, we've been lobbying national parks, we've been lobbying other government entities. I've been personally doing it now for 10 months and we haven't got one contract. With each of those contracts that we can generate, that will allow us to employ more local Aboriginal people, the people that I've been talking about, getting them in the jobs, helping them realise their aspirations of their own personal wealth creation, helping them build their own businesses and migrate, and helping their kids and their future generations. The big question for me is, will the same mistakes be made with the Aboriginal procurement policy as have been made with the Indigenous procurement policy? And we are the ones that need to hold government to account. So what do we need? As a local Aboriginal Land Council, as a grassroots community-controlled organisation, we need governments and businesses to strengthen the requirements of people and businesses identifying as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to ensure that they meet the legal and legislative definition. This will help to ensure that the intended benefits are actually targeted to the people that they're meant to be there for, promoting socio-economic outcomes and wealth creation for Aboriginal people right the way through that legislative framework, for the people that are out there still on the streets, still trying to actually find a hand up, for those people that are trying to find a pathway up, for the people that want to have aspirations that their children and their grandchildren will reach the standards of living that we now enjoy, right the way through to the people that we're trying to support. We need to make sure that those benefits are actually going to Aboriginal people, to the people that government has intended them to. We also need government staffing ensuring that they are applying the Indigenous procurement policy and the Aboriginal procurement policy ethically and transparently. It allows us to be able to leverage those purchasing opportunities to create real jobs and wealth creation for our people at the grassroots community level. We want to see Aboriginal millionaires, but we also want to see people aspiring to be able to get themselves out of relying on community and social housing. We want people aspiring at each generation getting better. We want that, but that's not what we're seeing. We need non-Indigenous people to embrace legitimate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander products and services, as it will open them up to life-changing experiences that they would not normally access. I talked about the creation story here on the Central Coast. Rather than actually going and listening to someone who found out about their claimed links to King Bungaree in 2004 and suddenly became a cultural expert, come and actually talk to the community who can take you and show you sites and pass on knowledge that has been passed down from generation to generation for thousands of years. I often liken it to Harry Potter, and my kids love Harry Potter. And Harry Potter, a mudblood is a wizard who doesn't have wizarding parents or grandparents, but suddenly is imbued with that knowledge. Sometimes the people who are claiming to be Aboriginal, to embrace and to leverage the economic advantages that are meant to be there for legitimate Aboriginal people, are like the Aboriginal versions of mudbloods. And like in Harry Potter, where Voldemort attacked him and he left him with that little scar, and he could suddenly take on some of the qualities of Voldemort, suddenly these people, within months of finding out about an Aboriginal ancestor that they haven't necessarily proven, but within months of that, can speak language of the experts on law as in LORE and culture. I often say to people, I find it absolutely amusing because the expectation of that over and above people who have had knowledge passed down and learnt the traditional ways, not just read in a book, but actually learnt through community, learnt the stories, learnt the narrative, learnt culture, are being disregarded. But quite often, the claims there of cultural authority, cultural law, cultural knowledge are about as magical as the story of Harry and the claims of Harry Potter. We also need non-Indigenous businesses to work in genuine partnership with legitimate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander businesses to build our expertise, knowing that we need to become independent when we are ready and when we choose to. For Darkinjung, we choose to work in partnership with non-Indigenous businesses, and we're going to do that for the foreseeable future. But we don't need people attaching themselves and undermining our self-determination. We want to continue to work in partnership because it is what we want and what we need for our people. What we need is people stopping, thinking, asking the questions, coming to us talking, not to make an assumption that you're dealing with an Aboriginal business. Come and talk to us. Not to make an assumption that the benefits are being passed down. Not to make an assumption that we'll need them forever or that we won't need them forever. But to come and work with us in genuine partnership. For me, that is what's fundamentally critical. If we want to decolonise the economy, if we want to tap into the cultural and the ancient and contemporary cultural knowledge and the benefits and the richness that we as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people bring to this nation, we need to decolonise the economy. But to do that, we need everyone's help to do it. Thank you.